Final Fantasy VII is a game that needs no introduction. An iconic entry of an iconic series, a leader of a ravenously popular genre synonymous with one of the most successful consoles of all time, and quite simply considered by millions to be one of the greatest games ever made. Remaking an old game to modern standards is never easy, but when you're remaking a game as historically relevant, beloved, and popular as Final Fantasy VII, so much weight lies on the developer's shoulders, not to mention the sheer length and story. But Square Enix did not back down from such a monumental task. Their ambitious initiative to remake Final Fantasy VII seemed unprecedented. They rolled the dice and looked to expand on the original as no remake had ever done before. And we were incredibly excited and quite nervous all at the same time. Final Fantasy VII differed from the game it's inspired by in many ways, and here we'll be talking about some of these big differences between the two. So, without further ado, let's discuss Final Fantasy VII Remake. One of the first things we realized about Final Fantasy VII Remake was that Square Enix intended to release the game across multiple installments. While fans were concerned for how that would impact the story, or if breaking the game into multiple parts would drag out the game, the developers of Final Fantasy VII insisted on quite the opposite. According to Square, when remaking the game, they were taking the chance to expand upon the promise of the original in every way, from gameplay and narrative to visuals and technology, which meant they were investing a lot more time and resource into various sections of the game, thus the multiple installments. Given how much Square Enix were zooming into Final Fantasy VII with their remake, it went without saying that the game made quite a few changes to the story. The large story beats being followed were mostly the same as the original. We did, however, see some tweaks here and there, as well as major events such as the Mako reactor being blown up by Shinra instead of Avalanche. When you think of villains in video games, Sephiroth has got to be one of the first names that pop into your head. While he took his sweet time to make his first appearance in the original, in the remake, he's gonna be around right from the get-go. In an interview with IGN producer, Yoshinori said that since everyone knows who Sephiroth is, there's no need for secrecy surrounding his identity anymore, and that the remake will build him up as a constant presence and a major threat to Cloud right from the beginning. Beyond the main story sequences and moments, the game expands in several other instances as well. Remake really fleshed out story moments greatly by expanding upon scenes, adding new dialogue, and expanding interactions between characters. These moments exist to give the player greater insight into the characters' backstories and help the game's world building. Similarly, you can expect several events and new scenes to be added, which serve to fill in even more meat on the bone of the story. This is one of the game's biggest changes and one with the most potential. The original Final Fantasy VII was a turn-based RPG, while the remake features real-time action combat with a tactical twist. The player's attack can be paused at any time to go into a tactical menu, where you can select abilities, magic items, and more. All of that is done through your ATB gauge, which leads us to our next point. Active Time Battle, or ATB, was a staple of Final Fantasy VII during the peak of the series' turn-based era. And even though Final Fantasy VII is not turn-based, it still features ATB, albeit a heavily modified version. Your ATB gauge will slowly fill up over time just like it did in the original, but in a neat twist. Actions during combat such as attacking enemies will make the gauge fill up faster. Using items, magic spells, and special abilities will cost at least one chunk of the ATB gauge. There's plenty of complexity in Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat thanks to various wrinkles and mechanics. The introduced pressured and staggered mechanics, while not exactly new to the series as a whole in some form or another, are new to Final Fantasy VII. Attacking enemies sees them building up a pressure gauge which fills up even faster when you hit them with attacks they're weak to. Once this gauge fills up, enemies stagger. Well, not only are they staggered, they also take significantly more damage. Staggering enemies to attack them with the likes of limit breaks or attacks they're weak to is a great strategy, especially for bosses. You'll be very familiar with the system if you've ever played Final Fantasy XIII. Given Final Fantasy VII's turn-based nature, each character differed from each other wildly in various ways. How you interacted with them for combat was always the same in the original, while the remake switches up things significantly. Each of the playable characters have a very unique fighting style to make them play differently. Cloud is a damage-based attacker. Tifa is more agile and specializes in quick and furious hand-to-hand combos. Barret specializes in long-range attacks and can attack enemies that are out of reach, while Aerith specializes in healing and magical abilities. Given that players can switch between characters during combat on the fly, there was no lack of variety during battles. Oh, we're not done talking about combat mechanics just yet. Summons are a core and integral part of any Final Fantasy game. The way they function in this remake is quite different from the way they worked in the original game. For starters, you're only able to use summons in boss fights or certain special fights upon meeting special conditions when using the required materia summons. Summons are AI controlled and will fight alongside you autonomously until the on-screen timer runs out. You're also able to use your ATB gauge to command summons to perform special attacks and abilities. The boss fights in the earlier section of the original Final Fantasy VII are hardly remembered as the most challenging, which makes sense because they served as elaborate tutorials to ease players into the game. However, with the remake focusing only on Midgar, boss fights are expanded like the rest of the game. Smaller and less important bosses are given much more prominence in the remake. Well, this one is kind of obvious. If Square Enix were focusing on Midgar and nothing else for the entirety of Final Fantasy VII Remake's first installment, it makes sense that they were gonna increase the size and scope of the game's location. It also fits how they're treating every other aspect of the game. Several Midgar locations from the first game have added entirely new locations of their own. It's not just the main story that has received all the love from Square Enix. It seemed they also focused quite a bit on side quests, which are just as high quality as the main story content. The game originally planned on having many more side quests than what we got. Square Enix, however, realized that they couldn't develop that many side quests upholding quality, so they decided to focus on a smaller number instead, and thus prioritizing quality over quantity. Our final opinion on Final Fantasy VII Remake is this. Square Enix knew they had a precious legacy to live up to, and they delivered by giving us the beloved story we all know in a modern presentation with beautiful cinematics, an expanded world, new side content, and a modern style of gameplay that will captivate new players and satisfy oldcomers alike. And that about does it for this video.